Okay, hi everyone. I'm going to get started straight away because we have a fair bit to get through. I've got some notes for this week's tutorial up on my blog. Again, the address is dave.if90.net, and under the menu item KIB204 tutorials in week 5. So just to recap what we've done up to this point is we've started to have a look at mashups, at some tools that we can use to help us create mashups, namely Yahoo pipes, and we've looked at some fairly technically simple ways of getting the information out of those pipes and into a web page as part of a mashup interface. And that was using the concept of badges. Now, I did tell you that there was other ways that we could pull the data out that were a bit more complex, but which gave us a lot more flexibility. And so this week we're going to start looking at that sort of thing. So we may or may not get around to doing an example where we actually do pull data from a pipe today. But what we will definitely go through is an introduction to the PHP programming language, which is what we will use to do that anyway. So whether we get around to the actual mashup example this week or next week, it doesn't matter. I just want to make sure that we go through and dedicate enough time just to learning the basics of PHP and therefore programming languages. Can I just get a show of hands of anyone who's had any experience with any programming language, not including HTML and CSS? Okay, a few people. So, okay, there's some people who know some of the general concepts of programming languages. Some people may have done PHP, that's fine. Again, I'm not expecting that you've ever done any programming languages before, so don't worry if you haven't. But what you will find is once you've kind of learnt the core concepts of one, they translate very easily over into pretty much every other modern programming language. So it almost doesn't matter which one you start with, as long as you learn the concepts. That's going to be a really useful skill, even if you just learn a little bit. Okay, so first things first, I've got a diagram here which sort of explains the difference between what you're probably used to working with websites up to this point. Is you've probably worked mainly with static websites where you create HTML and CSS documents, you put the content into those, upload them to the server, and when I use my browser and I go and request that file, it just downloads that file and presents it to me on the screen. So that's what we'll call a static website. So it's not dynamic or interactive in any way. If I want to update the content, I have to go in and modify the file and resave it and re-upload it. So that's okay, that's fine. It works in certain scenarios. If you have a finite amount of content that you don't particularly need to update that often, then it works perfectly fine. And in fact, for a long time, that's what every website was like. But then, obviously, with the advent of things like user-created content and websites with very large amounts of information, the static way of approaching web design just wasn't cutting it. So we've talked before about examples like Facebook and YouTube. So much data going through those that it'd be literally impossible for someone to manually update that content and have it viewable in any sort of reasonable time. So this is where we take advantage of dynamic websites. And so this diagram sort of explains the difference. So you have, as I said before, the static website is essentially the HTML files sitting on a web server, and you request them and it loads that file, displays it in the browser. Now, dynamic website, to the end user in the browser, doesn't really see any difference. What they get served up is still just HTML, but it's the way that that HTML is pieced together on the on the web server side that's different. So on the web server side, rather than just having HTML and CSS files, what you would have is some web scripting files. So in our case, we're going to be looking at PHP. It's certainly not the only web scripting language. There's plenty of other ones, but the idea is that you would instead of requesting a particular file, you target this web script, and it dynamically, based on what you're asking for, pulls together information from, let's say, a database, and maybe it gets information from other resources as well. Maybe it pulls it from different websites, as in the case of our mashup. But the point is that it's not a file just sitting there. It's pulling the information from different places and then compiling it dynamically on the fly, and then sending that back to the browser. And by the time it gets back to the browser, it does just look like an HTML page, but it's the way that that HTML page is assembled on the server that's different. It's the important thing. Okay, so PHP is the web server-side scripting language that we will be looking at. And one of the first things we need to know is that in order to execute the PHP script, the file actually has to be running on a PHP-enabled web server. So you might be used to creating HTML files where you can just create the file, save it, and then open that up directly in the browser, and it will display. You can't do that if you're going to have PHP code in there, because it needs the PHP program running on the web server to interpret the PHP code and then do whatever it needs to do. So if you want to follow along with the examples I'm going to do today, and again, it's up to you. I am screen recording this so you can watch it later on. But if you do want to follow along with me, what you're going to need is to save your files onto a web server, and you can use the Qt web server, which you possibly have used in the past. It has PHP enabled, and there's instructions here under using the Qt server space which tell you how to get to that. So if you have your own computer here and you're running Windows, what you need to do is open up a file explorer and type this address, /cif-smb.qt.edu.au, and then that will open up the server space in a folder, and you can put your files there. I don't think anyone's got a Windows laptop here, so it's okay. So for everyone else, if you're on a Mac, what you need to do is open up a Finder window. Okay, and what you want to do is go up to the Finder menu up here and hit Go, and then connect to server. And then you want to type in this URL or this address down here. So in this case, it's smb://. Okay, notice the difference on Mac. Always uses forward slashes. Windows uses backslashes for its URLs. Okay, and cif-smb.qt.edu.au, and then hit connect. Okay, and it will come up with a login. Now this is just your Qt login, so your student username and password. For me, it's my staff username and password. Okay, and once you've done that, it should pop up with a folder where you can see a public HTML folder like this. Anyone having troubles getting that to work? No, we're all good. Awesome. Okay, so what you're actually doing now is browsing the file structure on the Qt network. So this is not the hard drive on your computer anymore. This is actually the Qt web server, and specifically your space on there. Now, depending on whether you've used this or not, you may have folders within the public HTML folder. What I would suggest that you do is create a new folder within public HTML called KIB204. Okay, and inside of that, I would suggest creating a folder called, let's just call it week 5. Okay, so now this is where you want to save your PHP files when you're creating them so that you can view them on the web server. So to test that, what I'll get you to do first of all is open up a text editor. I checked just before, and these computers do seem to have Komodo edit, so I suggest using that one unless you have something else you'd prefer. I don't have Komodo edit on my computer, so I'm going to use one that I use called Aptana Studio. If you're looking for one at home, this one's quite good and it's free for web development. But really it doesn't matter, all we need is something to write a text file. So what I'll get you to do in whatever text editor you have is create a new file and call it, let's just call this intro _to php.php. And what you want to do is, whether you can save directly to the network or you need to save it, let's say, on the desktop first and drag it over, what you want to do is get this file onto into this week 5 folder on the web server. So in my case, yeah, question?
Is there an FTP client on these computers?
There usually is. I'm not sure which one, but I know there has been in the past. I just can't remember which one. Okay, so I am just going to drag mine across. Okay, but if you can save directly to there, then that's fine. If not, I'd suggest just saving it to your desktop or somewhere first and then dragging the file across. And then you can open it directly from this location. So I'm going to close this down and I'm going to reopen this file now that's sitting on my network drive. What we want to do is test that this is working first of all. So what I might get you to do is just create a very simple HTML document. Okay, so I'm just going to create HTML document with title, intro to PHP. Let me just make this font bigger. That's a bit better. Okay, and in the body, let's just put something so that we can see if it's working. Okay, so I'm just going to put a heading 1, and let's just put a hello world in there and save that. Okay, so this will just let us test that we can access this file. Okay, so once you've done that, I don't really mind what you put in there as long as it's something that will show up when you go to this address. But what you need to do now is, as the instructions here say, so to access this file once it's sitting on the web server, you need to use this particular URL. okay, which starts with student.ci.qut.edu.au /tilde, which is the squiggly character below the escape key. So if you hold shift and that key, that's how you get the tilde, and then your QUT username. Okay, so for me, being a staff count, slightly different, but similar. So mine's staff.ci.qut.edu.au /tilde, and then my staff username. Okay, but if you go to this address and if we log in, okay, you should see a directory listing of what's inside your public HTML folder. So you should see the KIB204 folder somewhere here that we created. And then the week 5 folder. And then inside of that should be your intro to PHP.php file. And if you click that, it should load up whatever you put in there. So anyone have trouble getting that to work? No? All good? Excellent. Okay, so from this point forward, you can just edit that file, and when you save it, you should just be able to refresh this page and see the changes. Now, what I'm actually going to do is something slightly different. I'm going to run this on a local web server that I have running on my computer, and that's simply just so that I can demonstrate a couple of things that I can't on the QUT one. So, but for everyone else, you just modify that document and save it and refresh. And I'll open this one up here.
Is that WAMP or yellow?
MAMP, yeah. So, just to explain that, so you have, okay, so once you go home and you want to continue working on your PHP files, you have a couple of options. You can either log into the QUT student server space using an FTP client, and if you scroll down to the bottom of these week 5 posts, I have a entire post that details how you do that. Requires installing a bit of software called a VPN to allow you to actually authenticate with the QUT network from outside of it, and then you use an FTP client with these details that I've listed here. So that requires that each time you save a file, it has to kind of save it over the internet. An easier way is probably to install your own local web server on your computer at home, which is what I'm going to be using to demonstrate here. And the easiest way to do that is probably to use one of these pre-packaged installers. So there's a thing called AMP. It stands for Apache Web Server, MySQL, and PHP, which is a very common web server setup. And there's a version for Windows and there's a version for Mac. So depending on what you're running at home, you can use either one of those. If you go to those websites, there'll be instructions on how to set that up. Essentially, you install that, you run the program that is the web server, and then you specify a folder on your hard drive which will become your web server folder. Okay, but for now, for today, because we can't really install software like that on these computers ourselves, and because you have access to the local network, it's easier just to use the QUT network. Okay, but for me, so this is, I have MAMP running here, and for me I have my local web server directory is this folder called sites, and so I've created this intro to PHP folder here, and my file is here, so that's the version I'm going to use. And for me to access that, generally what you do is you type in localhost, okay, and that gives me the directory listing of my sites folder, and I should be able to find, there it is, intro to PHP and intro to PHP.php, okay, which I haven't yet. anything in. Okay, but there it is. Okay, so I'll be running this example off my local web server. For everyone else, all you'll be doing is editing and resaving the file that you have running on your student web server. Okay, other than that, what we're doing is going to be essentially identical. Okay, so PHP. So the first thing to know about PHP is if you want to write a PHP file, the file extension has to be .php. Okay, simple enough. The second thing is you'll notice that essentially a PHP file can also be an HTML file. So our PHP files are usually going to be an HTML document interspersed with bits of PHP code. Now the way that we delineate which parts of this document are PHP code is by using opening and closing tags. Okay, just the same as we have opening and closing HTML tags to say that this piece of text is meant to be a heading 1. We have opening and closing PHP tags to say that the text between those is meant to be interpreted as PHP code. Okay, so what I'm going to do is get rid of that heading, and instead I'm going to put some PHP in here. So an opening PHP tag always looks like this. It's opening angle bracket, question mark, PHP. And a closing PHP tag looks like question mark, oops, question mark, alright, that I don't know what I was doing. Okay, question mark, close angle bracket. Okay, and anything that you write between these opening and closing tags is going to be interpreted by the web server as PHP code. Okay, so the first thing that you generally always learn in PHP is how to output stuff to the screen. And the way that we generally do that is using a built-in PHP statement called the echo statement. And the way that we do that is just to type echo, and then in inverted commas we type whatever it is that we want to output. So I can say hello world again. And then the last thing that we need to do is if we have multiple lines of PHP, each line needs to be separated by a semicolon. And often when you're writing PHP like this, you'll just do single lines like I've done here. In that case, the semicolon is optional, but it's good practice to remember to put it in anyway. Okay, I might just change my color theme because stuff is not showing up. Oh yeah, that's better. Okay, so that bit there now is our PHP statement. So what this is going to do when the web server runs this is it's going to read from top to bottom, and it's going to output anything that's HTML. And then whenever it comes across PHP code, it's going to send that to the PHP interpreter, and it's going to execute whatever PHP code we have in here. And once that's complete, it's going to continue on and keep outputting the HTML. So the echo statement very simply outputs whatever we have inside these inverted commas to the web page. So if we save that and go back to our browser and refresh the page, okay, you should be able to see that it's outputting hello world. We no longer have the heading tags around it, so it's just outputting it as plain text. Now, you remember I said before that all the browser sees is plain HTML, and we can confirm that by inspecting the HTML code, okay, and seeing that this is just an HTML document, and there's nowhere in here where we can see the PHP code. The PHP code all gets interpreted and run on the web server, and all the browser ends up seeing is plain old HTML. Okay, so there's my body tag, and then my hello world text, and then closing body tag. No mention of PHP in here. Okay, now, as I said, anything that's plain HTML is still going to be output, so we can actually wrap this PHP statement back inside of those heading tags, and it will output this as a heading. Okay, so if I put those back in, go back, refresh the page, can inspect that, and I can see there it is, it's output again as a heading 1. So really we can treat this PHP document as an HTML document, and anywhere we like really within this document we can insert PHP code which itself can output information, and all the browser ends up seeing is just a flat HTML page. So I haven't really done anything particularly useful yet, but we'll get onto that. So we'll leave that there. That can be our first little example. And what we'll do next is we'll look at the concept of variables. So any programming language is going to have these things called variables. And if you remember in school when you did algebra, okay, variables are essentially the same as saying let x equal 5 and y equal 2, then x plus y equals 7. So x and y, there are variables. They essentially just a thing which can store a value, which you can reassign that value, and you can use it as you know, in equations and things like that. So anytime we might want to store a value, we can create a thing in PHP or in any programming language called a variable. So for example, again, because it's PHP, I have to create my opening and closing PHP tags. And here you can see I've run this PHP over multiple lines now, so it doesn't really matter. PHP doesn't really care whether you do it on one line or multiple lines, as long as all the PHP you have is enclosed in the opening and closing PHP tags. Okay, and inside these PHP tags, what I'm going to do is create, or what's also called declaring, a variable. Now, different programming languages have different ways of specifying what a variable is. In PHP, all you do is you type a $, and then a name. So let's just say I want a variable to store my name, then let's call this name. Okay, and PHP will see that this has a $sign in front of it, and it will remember this name as a variable. So I can then refer to this later on and do whatever I want with it. Now, an empty variable isn't very useful to us, so what we want to do is assign it a value. And the way we do that is by saying equals, and then we give it a value. Now, we could give it a value that's a number, so name could be 1, 2, 3, 4, or we can give it a value of what's called a string. So a string in programming language talk is simply just text. So they're your two major types of variables that you will have is numbers and strings. And the way that you define a string is just like we've done up here, putting it inside inverted commas. So I'm going to say name equals, in inverted commas, Dave, semicolon to end the line, and so we've got this variable here, but we're not doing anything with it. So what I can do is use this echo statement to output that variable to the screen. So I can say something like echo my name is. Okay, and then I want to add on to the end of this. Actually, before we do that, let's just make this a bit simpler. Let's just echo out the variable name. Okay, and that should output for me Dave to the screen. Okay, so if I go and refresh this page, okay, there it is. It's outputting Dave. Now, I did start typing before my name is, and often you'll want to intersperse variables with other bits of text. Now the way that we can do that is by using something called the concatenation operator. So to concatenate means to join. So if we want to join two bits of text together, we can simply do something like this. So I'll go echo and then put my name is. Okay, and then to join these together, the concatenation operator is actually the full stop. Alright, and what that will do is it will join this bit of text with whatever is stored within name, join those two together, and then echo those out to the screen. Okay, so I'll save that and refresh the page. And there we go, so it's outputting that. Again, if we look at the code, okay, no mention of PHP code there, all we get is the result of PHP processing those commands and then outputting whatever we've told it to output. Okay, so that's one variable which we've stored as a string. Now let's say I want to change this and I'll have a variable for my first name and a variable for my last name. So I'll change this name variable to be first name. And this brings me to a point about the rules when it comes to naming variables. So there's certain rules that you have to abide by when it comes to naming a variable. The first thing is that it has to be one word, so you can't have any spaces in variable names. The second thing is it can only contain alphanumeric characters and some other characters like underscores and hyphens. And the third is that it has to start with a letter. Okay, but other than that, so the main thing that you will come across is having variable names that you want to call multiple words, and there's generally two conventions for displaying those. So I could just write this all as one word, first name, like this. Okay, but that tends to be a little bit difficult to read. So there's two things generally people do to make it a bit easier to read. The first one is to use an underscore between words. So that allows us to still have one word, but it separates the words. And then the other way of doing it is known as camel casing, where for every other word other than the first one, you just capitalize the first letter. So you might see me do either of those. And they're essentially just conventions in programming languages to make them a bit easier to read. Okay, so this one here is, and the other thing to note is that variable names in PHP are case sensitive. So first name with a capital N will be interpreted as a different variable to first name with a lowercase n. Okay, so that's the other thing to remember. Okay, so I've changed that variable to first name, and I'll create another one called last name, and we'll assign that as my last name. Okay, and down here what I can do is I'm going to concatenate these two variables together. So I'll change this to first name, and then again I'll use the concatenation operator, which is a dot. In a lot of languages this will be a plus sign instead of a dot, but in PHP this is a dot. And then I want to put my last name in as well. And I'm not quite finished yet, but I'll just show you what happens when I do this. If I refresh, okay, you'll notice that yes, it's joined those two together, but I've forgotten that I need a space in between my first and last name. So quite often you'll see these things concatenated together with a blank space in between. Okay, so this is actually joining together four different strings. The my name is, first name, a blank space, and last name variable. Okay, and that all gets output as one long piece of text. Okay, so we know how to create variables. So far we've created 2 variables which contain strings, so text information, but we can also create variables which hold numbers, and once we have those we can do mathematical operations on them. So let's create, say, 2 more variables. Let's create, like we were talking about algebra before, let's just create a variable called x and set that equal to 5. Let's create a variable called y and set that to be equal to 2. Alright, and then we can, because these are numbers, we can do mathematical operators on them. So, for example, we can say echo, and in fact, before we do this, what we might do is, to make this a bit neater, let's put paragraph tags around this here. So what I need to do to put paragraph tags around here is first of all close off my PHP tag so that I can write HTML, and then write my opening paragraph tag and my closing paragraph tag. And I need to make sure that I open up the PHP tag again and close it off here, and then reopen it up here. Okay, so that looks a little bit complex what I did, but all I'm really doing is making sure that my HTML code is outside of any PHP tags and my PHP code is within PHP tags. Okay, so if I save and run that, okay, now it should be outputting that string within a paragraph tag. Okay, so you'll find yourself doing this quite a lot, opening and closing lots of PHP tags. So it's good to indent your code so that you can kind of keep track of them nicely if you have PHP running over multiple lines. Okay, so we'll go back here where we've declared our number variables, x and y, and what I'm going to do is create another paragraph tag where I will, inside of that, have a PHP statement which echoes out, let's say we add these 2 numbers together. So we can say echo out $x plus $y. Okay, and refresh that. Okay, and we can see it comes out 7, a nice small number, so that we can confirm in our heads that that's the correct value. Okay, and if we wanted to, we can combine outputting strings with outputting numbers. So for example, I can say echo the sum of, and concatenate that with x, and y is okay, so this is going to join all of these things together, all these bits of text together, and then join those to the result of this mathematical function of variable x plus variable y.
Is there a reason why you put a space between the
between the dots and
no, between the writing and the quotation marks?
Just here,
yeah.
Just so that there's, because x doesn't have any spaces either side of it. If I don't put a space there, it's just going to be jammed straight up against the F there. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So it's just formatting, and the space between The end of here and the dots is optional. Again, that's just to lay it out to make it look a bit neater. I don't necessarily have to have those, but it's just a bit neater, a bit easier to read if I put spaces in between those things. Okay, so if I view that, whoa, hang on a second. Alright, what we have to do, what we actually have to do is store this value in a variable before we output it, I think. Let's try that. So let's create a variable up here called sum and set that to be equal to x plus y, and then we should be able to output sum here. Let me just check that works. Okay, there we go. Now, the reason that it did that before is actually kind of convoluted and has something to do with the fact that we were trying to join together mathematical functions with string functions. And again, depending on the kind of programming language, they will interpret that differently. In this case, what it did, I believe, was attempt to convert this string to a mathematical representation and then added it to a numerical representation. But if we take all of the arithmetic operators out of the echo statement, then it will output fine. So all I've done is create a third variable here, which stores the value of that equation and then outputs it there, and then outputs the way that we want it to. Okay, so the last thing I want to say about number variables is that there is a difference between having a number as a number like this and having a number as a string. Okay, so you can have a bit of text that contains a numerical character and treat that as text, or you can have it purely as a number. If you want to do any sort of mathematical operations on it, then you're going to want to have it as a number, so without the inverted commas. Okay, so that's just important to keep in mind that there is a difference between those two things. Okay, so let's move along now. Okay, the next thing I want to show you is something called comments, which again is a concept in pretty much all programming languages, and comments are designed to be ignored by the interpreter. They're essentially lines that we put in there just to write notes for ourselves or notes for other people, so to remind us of what things do, for example. And the way that we write comments in PHP is one of two ways. So I can write a comment up here above where I've declared these first name and last name variables. The first way I write a comment is with 2 forward slashes and then write the comment. So I could say create some variables to hold my name. Okay, and again, because these are PHP comments, they need to go within the PHP tag. HTML has its own style of commenting. They will go within the HTML outside of the PHP tags. So that's the first style of commenting. That's called a single line comment. You can, if you want, write a big long comment over multiple lines as well. And the way that you do that is by using opening and closing comment tags, and they look like this: /*. Okay, and then, so this program is automatically inserting some formatting for me, but all you need is the opening one, and then you can write a comment over several lines, and then once you've finished, you do the reverse of that opening tag, so */, and that will define the end of the comment. Okay, and if you have an editor that has syntax highlighting, it should show those as differently colored to the actual code. So anywhere throughout your code, if you're working on something and you want to write yourself a little reminder of what something does, then you can just throw in a comment, and then when you come back to that code, you won't have to kind of trawl through it and try and remember what everything's doing. Okay, so that's PHP comments. Done variables. Done strings. Okay, so I've just showed you the addition operator, but essentially any kind of mathematical operators that you're familiar with will work here, plus some that you probably never even considered. So you can do addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and then you can do things like modulus operator, which is like to get the remainder, and other fancy things like that. But they're all listed on some of the links which I've provided in the blog post. So I won't necessarily go through those in detail. Okay, so far we've created variables, but we haven't really done anything that we couldn't have just written in HTML. So I want to show you an example now of something that you couldn't possibly do with static HTML. And this is going to introduce a couple of new concepts. And what I'm going to do is, let's say I want to put a welcome message on my page, and depending on the time of day, I want it to say either good morning or good evening. So what I need to do is be able to see what time it is and compare that. And if it's, say, before midday, I tell it to say good morning. If it's after midday, I tell it to say good afternoon or good evening. And so what I need to do is, first of all, there's this concept of functions. Okay, functions are pre-built bits of code which you can call to run over and over again. And so there's a lot of built-in functions that are commonly used within all programming languages. And so PHP, this is the documentation site for PHP, by the way, that you possibly will refer to quite a bit, php.net. And so you can see it lists thousands and thousands of built-in functions. Now there's one called the date function, which allows you to retrieve the current date in certain different formats, depending on parameters that you pass it. And there's one here which will allow me to get the 24-hour format of an hour without leading zeros. So this will just give me the current hour from 0 through to 23. So what I can say is that if this value is less than or equal to 12, then I'll tell it to say good morning, and otherwise I'll tell it to say good afternoon. Okay, so first things first, let's get this function working. So again, I'll create some opening and closing PHP tags, and I'm going to create a variable called current hour. And I'm going to set that to be equal to, and then the way that I call this date function is, say, the name of the function, date, and then some functions, including this one, require that I send it extra bits of information so that it knows what to give me back. And in this case, as they are all listed here, I send it a particular string, okay, a particular bit of text which tells it how I want the date format back. So I want to send it a capital G, so it gives me back just the hour. So I do that like that here. Now you might see me alternatively using single quotes and double quotes for strings. They're the same, so it doesn't really matter which you use. The only thing I'll say about that is you might notice you might notice, let's say I have a string which contains, let's say I have a string which legitimately contains one of these characters. So let's say I want to have a string which contains a quote. So let's say I'll just go up here and, okay, and I want my string to be something like the quote is such and such. Okay, so you can see there's a problem here because it doesn't know, because I've included this character within this string, it doesn't know which is the start and which is the end. So what you can do is combine the single and the double quotes to make sure that they're all captured within. So if I use single quotes at the start and the end of this text string, then it will ignore any double quotes within. And similarly, if I have a sentence which contains, let's say I have single quotes and I have a sentence which contains a apostrophe, so like I say, Dave's car, okay, again, that's not working because as soon as it sees this single quote, it's closing off that string. I can just change those outer quotes to double quotes, okay, and it'll work again like that. Okay, so we can use either single or double quotes. They effectively do the same thing. Okay, so I've got the current hour, which I'm assigning to this variable called current hour, which I'm getting by calling the date function. And let's just for now echo out. And actually, sorry, we'll do this within paragraph tag again, just keep this nice and neat. Okay, PHP echo $ current hour. Okay, and I'll go back to the browser and back to my page here, and I'll refresh that. Okay, and I can see that the current hour is 13. Alright, which makes sense because it's 1 o'clock, that's the 13th hour. And actually, if we wait one more minute, it should click over to 14. So this is one of the reasons actually why I'm running this on a local server instead of the Qt server, because what this is doing is basing it off my system time. So I can change this system time on here and it will be reflected there, whereas I can't change the system time on the Qt web server. Okay, so we'll leave that there for a moment, and what we really want to do is set up this bit of code which gives us a different greeting depending on whether it's morning or afternoon. So this introduces us to the concept of conditional statements. So far all the code that we've written has just been executed line after line, one after the other, and every line of code has been executed. But we may have situations where, given a certain condition, we want one thing to happen, or given an alternative condition, we want something else to happen. Okay, so this is one of these cases where we want, if the hour is less than or equal to 12, we want it to say good morning, and if it's otherwise greater than 12, then we want it to say good afternoon. So the simplest and the most common conditional statement is called an if statement, and it goes something like, if this condition is true, do this, else do something else. Okay, so what we'll do is, actually now it's ticked over 2 o'clock, I should be able to refresh, see that changed to 14. Okay, so without changing the code, that now is something dynamic which has proven actually we've done something useful with PHP that we couldn't have done with just HTML. So I'm not going to come in here and every hour and update that value and resave that file. Okay, so let's put some new PHP tags just after where it's output the current hour. And I'll just modify this so I remember what it says, and I'll say the current hour is like that. Okay, so now inside these PHP tags here, I want to say, so I want to put my if statement. So the way that I do that is to say if, and then I have opening and closing parentheses, and it's inside of these parentheses where I tell it the condition that I want to be true if I want the first thing to execute. So what I have after the if statement is opening and closing curly brackets, and this, whatever lines of code I write within here is what will get executed if this statement that I put inside these parentheses happens to be true. And then I can have an alternative statement which I can say else. Alright, and then also have these brackets where whatever code I put inside these curly brackets is going to execute if that statement happens to be false. Okay, so let's create our conditional statement first of all. So the conditional statement I want is to detect whether this value of current hour is less than or equal to 12. So to do that, I can just say if $current hour. Okay, and then this here is a conditional operator. Okay, which you probably are familiar with from mathematics as well. So that's the less than sign. But what I want to say is if it's less than or equal to, which looks like this. So less than, then an equal sign. And then I want to say 12. So if the current hour is less than or equal to 12, then I want to echo good morning. And then why not let's include with that first name. Okay, and then else here, okay, is the alternative. Now this is optional, I don't have to do this. I could just say if that condition is not true, then just don't do anything. But in this case, I do want it to do something if it's not true, and that is I want to echo good afternoon. First name. Okay, and again, just to make this format neatly, I'm going to put this whole thing within paragraph tags. Okay, so it's going to be a paragraph and then either one of these and then a closing paragraph. Okay, and if we save that and go and refresh the page, alright, there we go, the current hour is 14. So if we go back to our code, current hour is equal to 14. Is 14 less than or equal to 12? No, it's not. So this doesn't get executed, and then this else or otherwise statement does get executed. So it says good afternoon, and it still remembers the variable first name up here, which is set to Dave. Alright, and now if I change this up here, so if I change Dave to Dave O, alright, that variable, because I've used that variable rather than hard coding that text down there, I only have to change that name once, and anywhere where I've referenced it, it gets updated. Okay, now just to show you that this does work either way, as I said before, this is something I can only do on my local server because it's running on my system. I can't change the QT clock. But if I go and change my system time and I set it to be 2 a.m. instead of 2 p.m. and I save that, okay, I haven't touched the code at all, but I go back and I refresh my page, okay, and then it says the current hour is 2, alright, and then it tells me good morning. Okay, so I'll go and set that back. Okay, so that now is something dynamic that we couldn't have done just by writing the HTML in there. Not unless we wanted to come back 2 times a day and change the welcome message to our web page every single day. Okay, so now we'll just extend this a little bit more, because we can actually have as many other conditional statements as we want. So let's say we want to add to this that once it hits 6 p.m. we want it to say good evening rather than good afternoon. So what we can do is modify this statement to say, so for the second one to be if, so once it gets past the first one, we can assume that the current hour is going to be greater than 12. Okay, so we want to say, okay, if we take it as a given that it's greater than 12, then if, so we can say else if current hour is less than or equal to 5. Sorry, we don't want 5, we want 24-hour time, so that will be 17. Okay, then it will say good afternoon, and then we can say else, and we could say else if current hour is less than or equal to 24, but essentially that's redundant because that's our only other option. So usually your last conditional statement is just going to be an else. So if all else fails, then we can assume it's not morning and it's not afternoon, then it's evening. Then we can say echo good evening first name. Okay, so again, to test this, I'm going to have to change my system date. So let's do that again. So we'll test all 3 cases. We'll do morning first of all. Okay, so it's 2 a.m. Good morning. We'll change it to the actual current time, 2 p.m. Good afternoon. And let's change it to now, say 6:09 p.m. Okay, and it goes to good evening. Okay, so there we have 3 conditional statements, and you can have as many added additional conditional statements as you like. Okay, so let's set this back automatically. Okay, so we're back to the current time. Okay, so we've looked at using built-in PHP functions, and we've looked at using conditional statements. Okay, now what I want to look at now is something that we're going to use heavily when it comes to processing our pipe feeds, our mashup feeds, and that is a data type called an array. So let's just say we have, and I'll create a new PHP tag here. So let's say we have a bunch of names that we want to remember. Okay, then we could create 3 variables called name1 equals Dave, name2 equals Cassie, 3 equals Deb. Okay, so we've got 3 variables which store 3 names now, but we might want to store 300 or 3,000 or 3 million names. And so I'm not going to go through and create a separate variable for each name. And in other cases, we may not know how many names or items we want to store. So for example, when we're processing our RSS feeds, there may be 10 items, there may be 12 items, there may be 100 items. We don't really know. So what we want to be able to do is have a way of dynamically storing a list of data without having to refer to each one individually. And so to do that, we can use a thing called an array. And now an array is effectively a list. So it's one variable name, but it refers to a list of items. So instead of writing it like this, what I can do is create and let's just say I want to have a group which has several names in it. So let's say I have a variable called group1. Okay, and I want those 3 names to be within it. So what I can do is create an array like this. Okay, by calling the array function. This is how we actually create an array object. And then I list the array items that I want to go within the parentheses here. So I'll list those here. Dave, Cassie, Deb. Okay, remembering that these are all strings, so I'm putting them all within inverted commas here. There's no reason that I can't store numbers as well within my array. Okay, I could do that, but for the sake of this example, I'm just going to have names as strings like this. Okay, so what I have now is one variable name referring to a list, and now I can add and take away values from this array now and still refer to it by just the one name. I don't have to go and mess around with individual variable names. So if we want to pull a bit of information out of this array, we need to know how to reference that. And the way that we reference an array is by using syntax that looks like this. So again, let's put this inside a paragraph. Okay, and I'm going to echo, and we'll see what happens first of all if we just echo out group1. Okay, so what happens if we just trace out the variable name to the screen? Let's see what happens. Okay, you can see it doesn't give us anything particularly useful. It just gives us the word array. It's just telling us that this variable is an array. It's not telling us what goes within it. So what we can do is we can reference one of these values based on what's called an index. So an index is a number which points to the particular position that an item is in the array. And the important thing to remember with indexing in PHP, along with most other programming languages, is that the first position is actually index 0. Okay, so Dave is at index 0, Cassie is at index 1, and Deb is at index 2. So there are very few programming languages that will actually put index 1 at the beginning, 1, 2, 3. Most of them will all have the first as index 0. Okay, so if I want to output the first item in this group array, what I do is I put the variable name of the array, and then I use square brackets, and inside of the square brackets I put a number referring to the index of the item that I want to access. So if I want to access the first item here, Dave, then I say group1, square brackets, index 0. Okay, and if I refresh this here, okay, there you can see that it's now outputting Dave. And just to test that the other two work, if I want to access the second item, then it's index 1. And there that outputs Cassie. and index2 outputs deb. And if we keep going, depending on the programming language, if you try and access an index that's out of bounds, it will usually throw some sort of error. Okay, in this case it just ignores you and says, well, there's no index 3, so there's nothing there, I'm not going to output anything. Okay, so that's how we access items in an array. So this is actually just one kind of array. But what we can have is something called an associative array. So this is an indexed array where the positions are referenced based on a number, but we can have something called an associative array where we can reference things based on a name as well. So let's say we create a new array. Alright, let's say we make let's just make another array like this, and we'll have group 2, which can have some other people in it. Okay, so an array, and in this one we'll have Jack, Jill, John, and James. Keep all those troublemaking J names together. Okay, so now we have two array variables which are two separate lists. Now let's say we also want to have a single list which stores all of our groups. So what I can do is create a variable called groups, and I'll set that equal to array. Okay, and I can actually put these other arrays within this array. So I could go group 1, group 2. Okay, so what we actually have here now is what's called a multi-dimensional array. Okay, so for the first array we have a list, and in each one of those lists, each item in that array contains another list. Okay, and you can do that as many levels deep as you want. And you'll see this quite a bit in our Yahoo Pipes feeds or our RSS feeds. So if you remember, if we had a look at what constituted the pipes data, there was a whole bunch of items. So you could consider that as a list of items, but then within each item there might have been another list of, let's say, categories that a particular video fits in. Okay, so that would be a list within a list. So we'll see things like that quite often. So what we have now is a list of groups, and each one of these groups is itself a list of names. Now at the moment this groups array is indexed based on a number, just like these other arrays are here. And so the way that I would now reference, if I wanted to reference any of these names through the groups array, what I'm going to do is say echo out groups. Okay, and now, so in the groups array there's two items, group 1 and group 2. So first of all I want to decide which group I want to target, and let's say we want to echo out Jill. Then what I need to do is first of all target group 2, which is going to be in index 1 of the groups array. So index 0, index 1. Okay, and we're now referring to this group 2 array. And inside here, Jill is sitting at index 0, index 1. So what I'm going to do is put another set of square brackets around here and put 1 in there. So this is telling me access index 1 of groups and then index 1 of the array that is within that position of that groups array. So it's actually quite a mouthful to explain, but once you kind of see how it works, it's not that difficult, I think, to kind of get your head around. So let's just see if this works. So So I refresh this page and there you can see it's outputting Jill. So if I change this 1 to a 2, this should output John. There we go. And if I change this first one to a 0, okay, it's going to refer to group 1 instead of group 2 here, and it should be outputting Deb. So 0 and 012. There we go, outputs Deb. Okay, now what you will find is that more often than not, we don't actually reference items in an array like this, because we aren't going to be able to predetermine what's going to be in that array and what position things are going to be at. So again, if we're talking about our pipes feed, all that we know is that there's a bunch of items. We don't know how many items there are. We just know that there's a bunch of them. So what we're more likely going to do is use a coding construct called a loop, and what that can do is just essentially keep going over the array until you get to the end. Doesn't matter how many doesn't matter how many items there are inside of that. So, but actually before I get to that, what I want to do is, I did mention briefly before that there were two different types of array. There's the number indexed array, and then there's the string indexed array, also called an associative array. So let's just say we want to change this top level groups array to an associative array, and I want to give each of these a name. So what I can do is put a string in here and say, well, this can be group 1, and then I use an equal sign with a greater than sign, which in this case looks like an arrow and is actually meant to be an arrow. It's essentially assigning this to that. And this one I'll call group 2. Okay, and what I can actually do is get rid of these first two variables, and I can define this all as one big array like this, and like this, and okay, and this is just formatted slightly differently now. Okay, so again, this doesn't matter if you write this all on one line or multiple lines, but what you should be able to see now, and the indenting should help a bit more, is that you essentially have one big array here, and inside of that is two items, this group 1 array and this group 2 array. Okay, and so each of these sub-arrays is an associative array. We can refer to it by its name rather than its number. And so when I come here now, rather than referring to a number to determine the group array, what I can do is say, find me the array called group 1, and within that get me the item at index, let's say 1. Okay, and so this should output then Cassie for me. There it is. So this way just makes it a bit easier to keep track of what things are called, rather than if I have sort of a 5-level deep array and I have to go, okay, 0, 2, 1, 3, 15, it gets a lot more convoluted. So by having an array as an associative array, actually giving it a name index instead of a number index, it makes it a bit easier. So I can say here, get me group 1 and then get me whatever item is at index 0. Okay, so if we want to output James, for example, then we can say, get me at the first level the array which is named 2, and then 0, 1, 2, 3 will output the name at index 3. Okay, and there's James. Okay, and this format here is what you're going to see very frequently in when we actually do start processing the pipes data. Okay, so the pipes data that you will see when you get it into PHP, it will give it to you as one massive big associative array. Okay, and it will have things here named like index and description and thumbnail. So knowing how to reference those things like this is going to allow us to pull out any bit of information out of that pipe we want and then output it with HTML any way that we want. Okay, so now just to backtrack a little bit, I did say that normally we wouldn't necessarily go through and reference things one by index. What we'd do is we'd actually loop over the array and output everything. So I'm going to show you how to do that. What we'll do is, let's say we'll loop over this group 1 array, and we'll output each of these names as list items in an unordered list, so we get these as bullet points. Okay, so what I'll do is, outside of this, so I've finished that paragraph now, and what I'll do is I'll create an unordered list. Okay, and inside of this, some PHP tags. Okay, and this is going to combine a bunch of what we've done so far. Okay, so what I want here, this is similar to what we did in the conditional statement. So the conditional statement was, given a condition, do either this or this other thing. Now a for loop or any loop construct is going to say, okay, repeat this code a certain number of times. So there's a few different ways you can do a loop. There's one called a for loop, and it looks something like this, where you create a temporary variable and you basically increment the value of that each time through the loop, and you tell it to keep going until that value is equivalent to something. So that's quite common, but it's actually not one that we're really going to use that much when processing the pipe data. So what I'm going to show you is a different kind of loop, which is specifically designed to loop over all the objects in an array. And that one is called a for each loop, and it looks like this. Okay, so you write for each, and then we have these brackets again, like we had with our if statement, and this contains a conditional statement. Okay, and then we have the opening and closing curly brackets, which says do all of the lines of code in between these brackets for each time you go through this loop. Now, as I said, this particular one is designed to perform a bunch of lines of code for each item that exists within an array. And so the way that we can do this is, what I'm going to do is this first, so we have for each something as something else, and I don't actually need this key part. Okay, but what this first variable here is going to be the name of the array that you want to loop over or iterate over. So if I want to loop over this group 1 array here, then I'm going to say for each group 1. Okay, so that's saying for each item in this group 1 array within my groups array here, and the as value here is creating a temporary variable to assign each of these values to each time it goes through the loop. Okay, so I'm going to call this item. Okay, and all I'm going to do here is echo the value of item. Now, I also want this to be within a list item, so rather than opening and closing PHP tags here, I can actually just output the HTML tags as a string. So I can output a list item like this, and then concatenate that with the item itself, and then the closing list item tag. Now, whether you want to output your HTML tags this way or by closing off the PHP tags and writing them as just HTML tags is up to you. Neither one is a right or a wrong way. The advantage of doing it this way, obviously, is that I don't have to write as many opening and closing PHP tags. However, the advantage of doing it this way is that you can see that as I've written them here, the syntax highlighting is just interpreting them as text. So you don't get the nice syntax highlighting that your editor might give you if you had just written them as part of the HTML block as HTML tags. So you can mix and match whatever you feel. I generally tend to prefer, especially once the document gets bigger, actually writing all of my HTML as HTML, not as part of the PHP. But just for the sake of a bit of speed and making it easier to read, I'm just going to echo them out like this time. Okay, so alright, so let's just re-look at this section and kind of step through on what it's going to do. So we've got our for each loop, which specifies two variables here. The first one being the thing that we want to loop over, and in this case I want to loop over group 1. Okay, and because group 1 is an array within a parent array called groups, and it's an associative array, I've indexed it with a name. I refer to it like this, so groups and then square brackets group 1. And then this as item here is going to be a temporary variable within that loop that's going to store the value of each of these items each time it goes through the loop. So the first time it goes through the loop, item should refer to Dave. The next time through the loop, item should refer to Cassie. The next time through the loop, item should refer to Deb. Okay, and then it shouldn't go any further because there are no more items within that array. So here, though, we could have output these by going echo group 1 0, echo group 1 1, echo group 1 2. Could have achieved the same thing. But this array might not have 3 names in it. It might have 3,000 or 30,000 or 3 million names in it. And so we're not going to sit there and write 3 million different echo statements to output all of those. This way it doesn't matter how many items are actually in the array. It's going to echo them out, whether there's 1, whether there's 3 in this case, whether there's 4, or whether there's 400. Okay, so let's see if that has worked. Okay, there we can see if we inspect the code. Alright, there's our unordered list, and there's our 3 list items, Dave, Cassie, and Deb. Okay, and to trace out this group 2 array instead, okay, even though there's a different number of names in here, there's 4 instead of 3, all I have to change here is group 2 instead of group 1. Okay, and it should output group 2's names instead. Okay, so this is going to come in handy, as I said before, in the case that we have a very long list of items, which we will have in our pipes feed, which has lots of sub items, and we can't necessarily tell beforehand how many there might be, because one day you might say you're searching for YouTube videos, you might do search results, one day it might return 10 results, another day it might return 50. So we can't just write code that's going to do output index 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 up to 50, because if there's less than 50 there's going to be an error, and if there's more than 50 then we're going to only output the first 50. Okay, so this way, and this really highlights what we talk about when we talk about the dynamic nature of this. It doesn't matter how much content we have there, with the same code we can output it all, whether there's a little or whether there's a lot. Okay, so I'm going to do one last thing to this, and that is to include a conditional statement within here. So I'm going to change this back to output group 1 array, and what I want to do here is, let's say if it's this is my name, if my name is the one that's being output, I want to start in a particular way. So I haven't actually added any CSS styles or anything to here yet. But let's just say we go up here and let's create some simple styles. So we'll go style. Alright, and I'm just going to create a single class called my name. Okay, and let's just say we'll make the font size 20 pixels and we'll make the color red. Okay, so we're used to applying CSS styles when we just have plain HTML, but now we have a mixture of HTML and PHP. So what am I going to do if I want this to output when my name, which I've got stored here as, we'll change this back to Dave. Okay, so what I want to do is apply a class here. So let's just look at applying the class first of all. It's really no different, again, because all the browser sees is plain HTML. Okay, it's going to be no different here applying a class than it is with plain HTML. Okay, so all we're going to do is we're going to output a list item with class equals and then my name. Remember how I refer that. Okay, my name. Okay, and here is another example of where you can see I've got quotes within quotes, so it's kind of screwing up with my definition of this text string. So all I'm going to do is change these outer quotes to single quotes, and then I can use double quotes for my attribute in here as part of the HTML. Okay, so this is going to apply it to everyone, first of all, so obviously this isn't the finished state, but this is just to show you that like adding PHP into the document here isn't necessarily making applying CSS styles to your HTML any more difficult. Okay, so we can see there it's, again, if we inspect the element, there's the list item, and each of these has the class my name applied. Okay, and there's the style font size 20, color red. Okay, so that's easy enough to apply a CSS style, but what we want to do is only apply it when the name happens to be my name. So what we need here is another conditional statement. So this conditional statement is going to sit within the for loop, and it's going to say, okay, if item is equal to first name, which I defined before, then echo out the list item with that class. Else, all I want to do is echo out the list item but without the class. Okay, and let's just make sure that works. Okay, so alright, so this hasn't worked, and it's not because our logic is wrong, but I did. Okay, so this might actually work. Okay, alright, so this is a thing that's variable between different programming languages, and I'm actually a little bit surprised that this has worked straight away. And so we could probably actually ignore that. But sometimes the equivalency operator is going to work different ways in different languages, and it's going to say that, well, item and first name, while they're the same string, they're actually two different variables, so they're not equal to each other. in this case, it seems to be doing that equivalency fine, so it's okay. So we can ignore that other equivalency stuff. So this is fine. This example now works. Now that, thank you for pointing that out, that I just had a typo there. So the logic for this now is we still have our for loop, but before we echo out our HTML code here, we first check to see if the item that we're looking at matches up with the value stored in this first name variable. And obviously the first time through the loop it does. There's Dave, and then the second 2 times it doesn't. So when it does, it outputs this with the myname class CSS style, which we defined up here. And if it doesn't match up, we output the just the list item without the class. So I could add an extra. I could add Dave again to the end here, okay, and it should output at the beginning and the end. Okay, so again, that kind of highlights the dynamic nature of web scripting languages, and this gives us a good basis for the tools that we're going to need to process the data feeds from our pipes for our mashups. And essentially, they're going to be big, long arrays, much larger than this, and it'll probably actually be slightly easier because we won't actually need to create our own arrays. They'll already be created for us. All we're going to do is read them in, and then we're just going to have to look at them and know what it's named various things so that we can loop over those arrays, pull out particular bits of information like the title, the link, the description, thumbnails, those sort of things, and then output those using the echo statement and a bit of our own HTML and CSS into the web page, and then we can create pretty much anything that we want in terms of a mashup. Okay, so I won't go on to the example with the pipe feed this week. I think I'll leave that for next week. I'm pretty happy just to leave it here. What I would suggest that you do this week is have a look at some of these resources specified down the bottom of the post here. So this Code Academy link here is a general programming tutorial. It actually uses JavaScript, but it's a nice interactive way of learning some basic coding concepts. And as I said, you learn one language, the concepts generally transfer over to most other languages. The only thing that differs is really the syntax, which is how you know what characters refer to certain things. So, for example, in PHP, having the $sign define a variable, that's a syntax thing that's unique to our PHP. Okay, so this might be useful if you want just a nice interactive basic introduction to programming in general. But then I'd also suggest you have a look at some of these resources, particularly the W3 Schools one. I haven't had much of a look through these other 2 links, but W3 Schools, as you might be familiar with, separates it up into nice categories. I'd suggest you look through everything up until forms. So if you look through everything up until functions, so functions, we didn't really go through creating our own functions, but that doesn't matter so much. We probably won't do that too much when we're processing our pipes. But if you looked up to everything, not including forms, get and post, then that's probably will allow you to go over everything that I've gone over today, but in more detail. Okay, so for example, it gives you a bunch more information about variables and strings, and as I was saying before, the different mathematical operators that you can use, they're all listed here, okay, as well as equivalency operators and conditional statements. So I'd suggest that definitely this week you read through these, it shouldn't actually take too long. The chapters aren't very long. If you can, I'd suggest either installing a PHP server on your computer, or working on it here, or working on it via an FTP client. Actually coding some PHP, especially if you weren't doing the example today. Just issues that you will likely run into is going to be very fanatical about the syntax. Okay, if you have multiple lines and you forget to put the semicolon on, then it's just going to plain not work. And what will happen there is, let's say if I take this semicolon out, okay, what will happen is you'll just come up with a blank page. So if you see that, if you're running your code and you're saving and refreshing, it comes up with a blank page, it means that you're going to have an error within your PHP somewhere. And generally the first thing always to look for is that all of your lines of PHP end with a semicolon. I'll go through in the coming weeks some ways to make it easier to identify where errors are happening. Other than that, I'm pretty happy if that's where you're kind of up to by next week. Are there any questions about anything specific that I went over today? No? Is that okay? Did that kind of make a little bit of sense? Yep. Okay, great. Cool. I mean, as I've kind of said all along, by no means do you have to end up being a PHP expert or a programming expert to kind of do the assignment here. We've already seen the way that you can use badges, which requires essentially no programming. But as well, all you really need to learn is learn what you need to as you go along to do whatever you need to do. So for that reason, there's a bunch of things that I'm probably not going to teach you about PHP that by all means you can learn about later if you want, but I'm going to specifically target the things that are going to be useful in the specific example of pulling data out of a thing and creating a mashup. So normally in an introduction thing, I probably wouldn't go that heavily into arrays and for loops, for example, but those specific things are going to be really useful, powerful tools for processing the data feeds. Hence, we're focusing more on those. And I think these concepts will become clearer as well when we do more specific examples. While these are kind of generic, it's a bit more difficult to see what the point of doing them is. But once we actually start processing pipe data, and you can see how things match up in the structure of that data and the way that we refer to it in the code, then I think it's going to make a lot more sense.